So now it gives me great pleasure to welcome Mr Neil Sharkey as our guest speaker this evening. I confess I've not had the pleasure of meeting Neil before, and though I'm aware that Ken knows him well from working at the Shrine of Remembrance, and indeed it was Ken who suggested he would be an excellent speaker. But I'll give you a brief introduction, noting that you may have already read the flyer for this talk. Neil attended the Parade College in Bundoora before he completed an arts degree with honours at Melbourne Uni, and after a 5-year stint working in reference and exhibitions at the National Archives of Australia in Canberra, he returned to Melbourne in January 2007 to take on the role of curator at the Shrine of Remembrance. In the past 17 years, Neil has developed dozens of Shrine special exhibitions, including his latest Designing Remembrance, which is currently on display, as well as the Shrine's permanent Second World War gallery. In 2022, his exhibition, I wish I'd seen it because I love the title, Lust, Love, Loss, Australian Stories of Wartime Relationships, won the Australian Museum and Gallery Association Award for Best Exhibition for a medium-sized organisation. So, with all that curatorial experience already, I'm sure he is well placed to provide us with various aspects and views on the RA in the Pacific during the Second World War. So please provide a warm welcome for Mr Neil Sharkey.
Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, that's good. Alright, I'll just launch in then. When most Australians reflect on the Second World War in the Pacific, they tend to think about Australia's land campaigns in the region, the desperate battles fought at Malaya, New Guinea and Borneo. However, these land campaigns, hard fought and as bloody as they certainly were, must be recognised as aspects of a much wider conflict fought against the vast Pacific Ocean. The Pacific War was, at its very core, a naval struggle. Imperial Japan's ultimate defeat was only possible due to the destruction of its powerful navy and the severing of sea communications between Tokyo and Japan's far-flung Asian and Pacific conquests. The major actors in this, history's greatest naval conflict, were of course the immense fleets of Japan and the United States. Nevertheless, the Royal Australian Navy did play a notable and active role in concert with the Americans and to a lesser extent the British. Tonight I'm going to speak of the activities and achievements of Royal Australian Navy sailors between 8th of December 1941 and the 2nd of September 1945 and examine how they contributed to ultimate Allied victory. Japan's entry into the Second World War, as far as the Western powers were concerned anyway, the Chinese have a very different view, was initiated with 2 concurrent attacks on the 7th and 8th of December 1941. One was the invasion of British-controlled Malaya from Thailand. The other was, more famously, the surprise attack by Japanese carrier-borne aircraft, which crippled the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Japan's Day of Infamy brought America into the Second World War and set the scene for a titanic struggle in the Asia-Pacific. Japan's war strategy was underpinned by the assumption that just as the Russo-Japanese War had been decided by a single decisive battle, in that case May 1905's Battle of Toshima, so too would Japan's war against the United States. From its military bases in China, Taiwan, Indochina, Thailand, and the Caroline and Marshall Island chains in Micronesia, Japan sees key objectives across the Pacific, creating a vast defensive perimeter which they plan to defend fiercely against any Allied counterattacks. The Japanese reasoned, perhaps naively, that the United States, Britain and the other Western powers would have no choice but to sue for a negotiated peace settlement. The Japanese knew that the industrial might and vast manpower of the United States made it a potentially irresistible foe, but They calculated they only needed a navy 70% the size of the Americans to achieve victory in the defensive war that they planned and hoped to fight. The preemptive attacks on Pearl Harbor and British Malaya had been undertaken to achieve a rough parity between Japan and its enemies. Japan believed that its more experienced and better trained naval and air crews would win the day thereafter. Japanese war planners had hoped to land a decisive opening blow that would force the Americans to seek peace terms. The Pearl Harbor attack, although tactically successful, would ultimately prove a failure because the key target, the 4 American fleet carriers, were at sea that day. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the raid's planner, became despondent when he learnt of the survival of those carriers. He knew that the war was as good as lost. The British and Australian governments, meanwhile, had invested much faith but few resources developing the Singapore naval fortress in the years leading up to the outbreak of war with Japan. Singapore, however, would prove no deterrent whatsoever to the Japanese. 2 Royal Navy capital ships, the battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse, were sent to the South China Sea to intercept the Japanese invasion fleet, landing troops at Kuantan on the Malayan east coast on 10th December 1941. Within half an hour of contact with enemy torpedo and dive bombers, the 2 mighty ships were battered, sinking hulks. HMAS Vampire, one of 4 escorting destroyers, could do little more than rescue 221 of the survivors. The conquest of the supposedly impregnable Singapore followed on 15th of February 1942. By the end of March, Japan controlled all of Southeast Asia and had imprisoned over 100,000 Commonwealth troops, including 22,000 Australians. Australia responded by withdrawing most of her troops and warships from the Mediterranean to strengthen national defence. An American, British, Dutch and Australian command, hastily thrown together to stem the Japanese onslaught, suffered many setbacks, including crushing naval defeats at the Java Sea and Sunda Strait on the 28th of February and the 1st of March 1942. The Australian light cruiser HMAS Perth, in company with the American heavy cruiser Houston, encountered a Japanese invasion fleet of 50 transports protected by 3 cruisers and 9 destroyers at Sunda Strait. Perth and Houston were sunk in the ferocious melee that followed, as were 2 Japanese transports and a minesweeper. David Manning, who some of you may remember and have known, was a gunner on board Perth when she was sunk off Java at the Battle of Sunda Strait. David, who I was proud of to count as a friend, died in February 2018, but shared this memory with me in 2011. During the battle, the Japanese destroyers kept us illuminated with spotlights and poured fire on us. I was on an anti-aircraft gun. We'd knock out a flood lamp on one enemy vessel and another ship would immediately switch theirs on. The battle was absolute bedlam. But I wasn't scared until I found myself in the water. Then I was really scared. Of the 1,061 men aboard Houston, 368 survived, only to be captured by the Japanese. Perth, meanwhile, lost 357 men killed, with 223 captured, David being one. David recalled being well treated by the Japanese sailors who rescued him from the water. The prison cards they encountered once they reached land, however, were another matter. The commanders of both cruisers, Captain Hecht Waller on the Perth and Captain Albert Brooks on Houston, both went down with their ships. Of the Perth men captured by the Japanese, 105 sailors and 1 airman died, whilst prisoners of war, 53 on the Burma-Thai Railway alone, and 38 as a result of Allied air attacks on the Japanese hell ships, transporting the men from one camp to another. Only 217 men, less than 1/3 of Perth's original complement, lived to see Australia again. I could talk more about the tragic losses of other RAN ships at this time, but I think that Perth's fate well underscores the desperation of this early phase of the war in the Pacific. The Royal Australian Navy, already battle-hardened after 2.5 years of war with Germany and Italy, carried a disproportionate burden of fighting in this early phase and suffered heavily as a consequence. His Majesty's ships, Canberra, a heavy cruiser, Yarra, a sloop, the destroyer Vampire, and Bathurst-class corvette Armidale were all lost in separate actions in 1942, along with Perth. The Japanese now went about undermining the Australian and American defences in Northern Australia. Japanese naval aircraft devastated Darwin on the 19th of February. Practically all civilian and military facilities in Darwin were destroyed and 243 people died. Captain Mitsuo Fushida, who led the carrier-borne aerial attack on Darwin, as well as the earlier raid on Pearl Harbor, described the action as using a sledgehammer to crack an egg. We just see in the foreground of the photograph here, minesweeper HMAS Dollaraine. So you can check this. I know you've all been to HMAS Castlemaine down at Williamstown, same sort of ship, so you get some sense of the scale of the mayhem that's going on behind this vessel. 64 more raids on Darwin would follow this initial attack in the coming months, but none would match the ferocity of the first. A similarly devastating attack on Broome came on the 3rd of March 1942. Other northern towns, including Mossman, Katherine, Wyndham and Townsville, were struck by smaller raids, also in the months that followed. Britain's perilous position in Europe and inability to counter the Japanese led it to abandon the Pacific, ceding control of the theatre to the United States and Australia in March 1942. The British determined to resist the Japanese in the Indian Ocean, but Britain's woes would continue. On the 9th of April 1942, a powerful enemy naval aircraft force located the British aircraft carrier HMS Hermes and the Australian destroyer HMAS Vampire off Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. Hermes sank with the loss of 307 men. Vampire too was sunk, and her captain and 7 crewmen also killed. The Royal Navy withdrew its assets to East Africa for many months after the sinking, abandoning the Indian Ocean to the enemy as well. But the Japanese were unable to capitalise on their success. American pressure soon forced them to abandon the Indian Ocean to bolster their strength in the Pacific. Ostensibly abandoned by its traditional protector, Australia had little choice but to throw its lot in with the Americans. Japan, having extended its influence deep into the region through conquest, now attempted to sever sea communications between Australia and the United States by pushing southeast into New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Fiji and Polynesia. Japanese military planners well understood the strategic value of these islands, both as bastions to shield her newly won conquests in Southeast Asia, Malaya, the Netherlands East Indies and the Philippines, and as well as a base from which to project air power over Northern Australia and its approaches. Controlling these islands would help seal off the most direct Pacific sea lanes between Australia and her immensely powerful ally, and deny the Americans an important staging post for their own amphibious operations in the Southwest Pacific. 3 Japanese midget submarines, meanwhile, were launched against Sydney Harbour on the 1st of June 1942. This is quite an amazing photograph. It's the last photograph taken by the crew of one of the 3 midget submarines. So the midget submarines only had a crew of 2 men. So what these men have done is they've shaved their heads and there was then a tea ceremony, and they put on perfumed uniforms, and this is the way that they psychologically prepared themselves for what they were just about to do, which is extremely hazardous, as you'll appreciate. The 3 2-man midgets were uncoupled from their parent submarines, the I-22, I-24 and I-27, and entered Sydney Harbour on the 31st of May 1942. They would not long survive. The bodies of the crew from the I-22 and I-27 midgets, including the men that we just saw, were recovered within days. Royal Australian Naval personnel cremated the 4 men with full military honours, an event which was filmed and exhibited worldwide. The Australian government hoped that the gallant treatment afforded to these brave men might help secure fair treatment for the thousands of Australians in Japanese custody. It did not. The I-24 midget, meanwhile, torpedoed a converted harbour ferry, HMAS Cuttable, at dock whilst attempting to sink the cruiser USS Chicago, which was in harbour in Sydney at the time. 21 RAN ratings asleep aboard Cuttable died. Sydney and Newcastle were thereafter shelled by 2 of the midgets' parent submarines, I-21 and I-24, a week later. So all of these activities were designed to unnerve the Australians and to break the country psychologically, I suppose. Between May and August 1942, Japanese submarines sank 7 merchant ships along Australia's east coast. Many Australians, understandably, feared invasion. The 2 naval battles would end any conceivable threat to Australia itself. Significantly, it was carrier-borne aircraft alone that decided these engagements. The American and Japanese ships that took part in these battles never exchanged a shot or even sighted one another, but fought with carrier aircraft alone. Royal Australian Navy codebreakers supplied the Americans with vital intelligence that helped secure these momentous battles. On paper, the Battle of the Coral Sea, fought between the 4th and the 8th of May 1942, was a tactical victory for the Japanese. An American fleet carrier, Lexington, was sunk, and another, Yorktown, very badly damaged. The Japanese, by contrast, lost a light carrier, Shoho. Each side lost roughly the same number of aircraft. But Coral Sea would prove a decisive strategic defeat for the Japanese. Japanese amphibious assaults. The Japanese amphibious assault on Port Moresby was cancelled, and their southwards advance halted. HMAS ships Australia and Hobart were with the Americans at Coral Sea. At Midway, in early June 1942, the Japanese suffered an unmitigated catastrophe. Here, the Japanese lost 4 of their major fleet carriers, 248 of their best naval aircraft, and most significantly, the crack crews of those aircraft, who until their demise had been the most skilled naval aviators in the Pacific. The loss of Japan's invaluable naval air assets, integral components of the juggernaut with which Japan had won all of her great naval victories at the outset of the war, severely curtailed her future activities. It was now impossible for the Japanese to push their conquests further south or east beyond Bougainville and the Solomon Islands, where they had landed troops in March and April 1942. The Japanese nevertheless proceeded with their invasion of mainland New Guinea. Their naval setbacks forced them to undertake an overland rather than a seaborne assault on Port Moresby. The resulting Kokoda campaign of July 1942 to January 1943 ended in failure, as did an amphibious assault on Milne Bay in August and September 1942. When an Allied task force, which included HMAS ships Australia, Canberra and Hobart, landed American Marines on Guadalcanal in the Solomons on 7th of August 1942, Papua became a strategic backwater overnight. Japanese High Command knew there was very little point diverting important resources to Papua while their position at Guadalcanal remained in flux. In any case, at this stage of the war at least, the Japanese calculated that they might still succeed in the Solomons. Japanese naval assets in the region remained substantial enough to inflict serious losses on the Allies, and indeed they did. The strait between Guadalcanal and Florida Island is called Iron Bottom Sound today. 32 Allied and 18 Japanese vessels lie there. Among them, the Australian heavy cruiser HMAS Canberra, sunk on 9th of August 1942. The Americans would, however, overcome the great logistical challenges of maintaining their invasion force at Guadalcanal, and they would retake the island in February 1943. So, yeah, it's a pretty extraordinary stretch of water, that. Australians were directly involved in Japan's next major defeat. On the 3rd of March 1942, a Japanese naval convoy bound for Lae in New Guinea was destroyed utterly by Australian bombers of No. 22 and No. 30 Squadrons RAAF in combination with American aircraft. Japan lost 8 transports and 4 destroyers, as well as the ability to properly supply, reinforce or evacuate their troops from mainland New Guinea, or any of the surrounding islands for that matter. Powerful Japanese garrisons at Rabaul in New Britain and Truk in the Caroline Islands in modern Micronesia were now isolated. The steady reduction of Japanese naval and air power in the Southwest Pacific and the steady build-up of American forces allowed the Royal Australian Navy to shift focus from sea battles to amphibious assaults, convoys, patrol duties, survey and fire support, and minesweeping missions. Australian naval and merchant shipping sustained Australian land offensives in New Guinea. By war's end, over 1,000 coastal convoys had been escorted by RAN vessels in that theatre. I'll just take a small break in the presentation to speak of a couple of important aspects of Australia's naval role in the Pacific that are often forgotten. In the foreground of this slide is an example of what one might argue was Australia's most significant warship type of the war in the Pacific. HMAS Bendigo here was one of 60 680-tonne Bathurst-class corvettes built at 8 Australian shipyards during the war. 36 of these vessels served in the Royal Australian Navy in the Pacific, and 20 more with the Royal Navy in the Indian Ocean, although they were crewed with mostly Australian sailors. The corvettes performed a variety of duties as convoy escorts, minesweepers and anti-submarine patrol vessels. A Bathurst-class corvette, the Deloraine, achieved the RAN's first victory over a Japanese submarine the I-124, which was sunk northwest of Darwin on the 20th of January 1942. Only one of those corvettes was lost to enemy action, the Armidale, sunk by Japanese aircraft in December 1942 whilst reinforcing guerrilla forces and evacuating civilians from Portuguese Timor. So, you have to agree, a very successful type. Some 20,000 RAN sailors served in RAN corvettes during the Second World War, making these men the RAN's single largest grouping of personnel. 3 corvettes, Ballarat, Cessnock and Ipswich, were present at the Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September 1945. Beyond and to the right of Ballarat is the hospital ship Wanganella, one of 4 Australian hospital ships during the war. The ships were staffed by Army rather than naval medical staff. All were painted white, clearly marked with red crosses and green stripes, and illuminated at night. Centaur, one of these ships, was nevertheless sunk off the Queensland coast by the Japanese submarine I-177 on the 14th of May 1943. Only 64 individuals of the 332 people on board survived. One of the most famous Australian military actions of the Pacific War, Operation Jaywick, occurred on the night of 26th of September 1943. 6 Z-Force operatives, a mix of specially trained sailors and soldiers, paddled canoes into Singapore harbour and attached limpet mines to the hulls of enemy ships, sinking 7. The men then rendezvoused with 8 comrades aboard the Crow, a captured Japanese fishing vessel which had transported them to Singapore. A second operation, Remau, followed in October 1944. 3 enemy vessels were sunk, but all 23 operatives involved were killed, captured, and executed. So, we'll return to the main narrative of the talk. I just wanted to make that little aside there. I wasn't sure how else to fit those interesting stories in. The United States avoided a major naval action with the Japanese for 2 years after Midway. The Americans concentrated instead on building vast numbers of ships, aircraft, and other weaponry and training their crews to operate them. The new assets that became available in 1943 and 44 were directed against lightly defended but strategically valuable islands. Every island conquered provided a new base from which subsequent attacks against other Japanese positions could be launched. So this is American Marines being landed on an island by an Australian vessel. So Australian soldiers fighting in New Guinea were largely excluded from this island hopping strategy, codenamed Cartwheel. Not so Australian sailors and airmen, who provided valuable support for American amphibious assaults against the islands of New Guinea and the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, as well as the Philippines. Australian warships and support vessels aided American landings at Cape Torokino, at Bougainville, Matape in New Guinea, as well as Numafor and Morotai in the Dutch East Indies. These landings would prove vitally important for the future Australian land campaigns on Bougainville, New Guinea and Borneo. The United States Navy, meanwhile, advanced across the Gilbert, Marshall and Caroline Island chains en route to the Marianas. The Imperial Japanese Navy remained a threat, however. Australia's third and final remaining Perth-class light cruiser, HMAS Hobart, was torpedoed on the 20th of July 1943. Hobart survived, but remained out of action for 2 years. Its incapacitation was keenly felt, following as it did earlier sinkings of cruisers Sydney by the Germans, Perth, and the heavy County class cruiser Canberra that I've already mentioned. Another County class, HMAS Shropshire, was transferred from the Royal Navy to redress the capability gap, and she took her place alongside Australia's only other serviceable cruisers, Australia and Adelaide. As American naval power grew phenomenally through 1943 and 44, and the Japanese knew time was against them. They now sought a decisive sea battle to end the war before they were completely overwhelmed. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, or the Marianas Turkey Shoot as it became known, was history's largest carrier versus carrier engagement and ended in disaster for Japan. Japanese losses numbered 3 carriers and 600 planes versus losses of 123 American aircraft. On the 21st of October 1944, HMAS Australia became what many consider to be the first victim of a suicide kamikaze attack, while screening American landings at Panayon in the Philippines. 30 crewmen, including its commander, Captain Emile Deschanel, DSC, were killed. The quality of Japanese air crews by this stage of the war was abysmal, and they knew it. Kamikaze pilots required far less training than conventional pilots, but could more reliably inflict damage. In the new situation Japan found itself, suicide attacks also sent a powerful political message. Japan would fight to the bitter end. In the closing months of the war, 47 Allied vessels of all types were sunk by kamikaze attacks, and another 300 were damaged. HMAS Australia would suffer further kamikaze strikes on the 5th, the 6th, the 8th and the 9th of January 1945. HMAS ships Shropshire and Arunta, meanwhile, distinguished themselves fighting the battleship Yamashiro at the Battle of Leyte Gulf on between the 23rd and 26th of October 1944. This was history's greatest ever naval battle, and in it, Japan lost a further 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and 300 planes. Just staggering. Its naval power was utterly broken. US losses, meanwhile, were 3 light carriers and 200 planes. So, this is just how unevenly these battles had become. The American push north continued. Japanese island fortresses like Iwo Jima and Okinawa became bywords for horror and futility as thousands of Japanese died in combat or suicided rather than surrender. Ultimate victory was now certain, but Allied commanders feared it would be monstrously bloody and costly in the face of this kamikaze fanaticism. Britain and Australia, meanwhile, had another concern: that Commonwealth war aims would be sidelined in the new peace. From late 1944, Britain began transferring ships to the Pacific to counter American dominance. The British Pacific Fleet's arrival at Sydney Harbour marked the end of a long absence by the Royal Navy from the Pacific Theatre. Australians, long accustomed to housing and feeding large numbers of American servicemen, welcomed the British warmly, and 12,500 Australian households billeted as British sailors. Australia's N and Q class destroyers and 18 corvettes were assigned to the British force, an arrangement that was familiar and welcome for many of these sailors, keen to re-establish traditional imperial ties. It's like one last gasp of the British Empire. The British Pacific Fleet was first employed during the invasion of Okinawa between April and June 1945. From July until war's end, it took part in operations off the coast of Japan's home islands, bombarding key towns, docklands, factories and airfields. The Australian reconquest of Borneo in the very closing stage of the war provided an opportunity to restore national prestige and to remind the Americans of Australia's fighting prowess. The successful campaign, fought between the 1st of May 1945 and 15 August 1945, remains Australia's largest ever amphibious operation. Royal Australian Naval landing ships Manura, Canimbla and Westralia ferried men and supplies between Borneo and the Allied base on Maratai. Other RAN vessels provided fire support and undertook patrol, escort and surveying duties. The Allied plans for the invasion of Japan, which so many had feared, became redundant after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the 6th and 9th of August 1945. The Japanese formally surrendered as a ceremony aboard US Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September 1945. HMAS ships Shropshire and Hobart laid anchor nearby. The RAN was heavily involved coordinating the subsequent enemy surrenders at WWII and Rabaul in New Guinea, as well as Bougainville, Borneo, Maratai, Hong Kong, Timor and Nauru. In the following months, Australian sailors helped repatriate thousands of servicemen and women, newly released Australian prisoners of war, enemy combatants and civilians. Minesweeping continued for many years. Indeed, the corvette HMAS Warrnambool would be sunk by a mine off the Great Barrier Reef in September 1947. The RAN had played a vital role in the Allied war effort and expanded dramatically during the Pacific War. It operated a total of 337 vessels, ranging from heavy cruisers to motor launchers, as well as the infrastructure to support them at port and on countless naval operations. On 30 June 1945, the RAN grew to its peak strength of 39,650 individuals. Of this number, 2,560, just over 6% of the total, were women, serving in the Women's Royal Australian Naval Service, a non-combat branch of the Navy formed in April 1941 to alleviate manpower shortages. The women served beyond traditional women's roles, such as telegraphists and clerks, and serving as drivers, mechanics, harbour messengers and orderlies. Many worked in war-winning code-breaking signals unit, the Fleet Radio Unit. A further 57 women, meanwhile, served as sisters of the Royal Australian Naval Nursing Service, the smallest of Australia's women's services during the war. RANs provided comfort to thousands of sick and wounded sailors throughout the war. Women did not serve in RAN vessels during the war. No woman would serve on an Australian warship until 1983, but 6 women sailors died in service due to accidents or natural causes. In all, 2,170 serving RAN personnel and 845 Australian merchant seamen died from all causes during the war. These men and women forged the proud legacy enjoyed by the RAN to this day. And I'll just leave there.
So one of the things that I'm really glad you did mention, amongst all the chaos of 1942 and the losses that we suffered. But always mindful of, you did mention it, that the Bathurst class made such a significant difference to our contribution in terms of convoy, escort, minesweeping, and operations under the enemy's nose, up in around New Guinea in particular, including the Fairmiles. I'd like to talk about them a bit more later. You didn't mention manpower. Well, you did mention manpower strength right at the end of the war. What strikes me is we owe a huge debt to the Naval Reserve during that time.
Yeah.
The Navy was swelled enormously to be able to keep those ships at sea by part-timers.
Yeah.
Well, they were full-timers, but in for the
The
job.
Navy, and they used to, you probably all know about like the different markings on the rank markings on cuffs and so forth, that you'd be able to tell like a regular Navy guy pre-war from the guys who just joined for the duration. Look, I mean, with this whole talk, I'm sure that there's very little of what I've said today that you haven't heard before, or you don't know. I guess what I was really hoping to do was just to provide a sort of an overview of trying to kind of synthesize it all down into things. So I hope I've done that, and but it's a real pleasure to speak with you and for you tonight. And thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Well, you saved me having to say it. It covered exactly what I wanted to say. You provided a great summary of a huge period of importance in our naval history in a relatively short period of time. And I think you did a superb job. Thank you very much for that. We will, of course, we have recorded it, so that will be available on the NVN website in due course. But I think, having made yet another contribution to Navy history, you should indeed have a Navy history.